Elias Thorne was not a man who believed in the grand gesture. He believed in the steady, quiet accumulation of things. A well-stocked wine cellar, a first-edition collection of his favorite poets, and a retirement fund that promised a future of undisturbed peace. His life was a meticulously curated library, and at the center of it was Julian. Julian had been his friend for 30 years, his business partner for 20, and his anchor for the last 5, ever since the divorce. When the diagnosis came, a manageable arrhythmia, but one that required a quieter life, Julian had clapped him on the back. "Retire, old friend. I'll mind the shop. Think of it as an investment in your peace of mind." Elias had agreed, signing over operational control while retaining his 45% stake. He trusted Julian implicitly. That trust was a book Elias had shelved without ever reading its contents. The betrayal was not a sudden dramatic fire. It was a slow administrative damp. It began with quarterly reports that felt polished, too clean. Then came a letter from a supplier Elias had used for decades asking about a change in payment terms he knew nothing about. A knot of cold unease tightened in his stomach. He hired a forensic accountant, a quiet woman named Sarah who spoke in facts, not feelings. 3 weeks later, she sat in his study, surrounded by his beloved books, and laid the truth on his mahogany desk. "It's elegant, really," she said, pointing at a spreadsheet. He set up a series of shell companies. They provide consulting services to the firm at inflated rates. The money flows in, then out, then back to him. He's been systematically diluting your share of the profits for 4 years. He wasn't just minding the shop. He was liquidating your section of it. Elias felt the world tilt. It wasn't the money, though there was plenty of it. It was the meticulous, quiet violence of it. Julian had stolen his peace, his security, and the story of their friendship, replacing it with a ledger of deceit. Elias didn't shout. He didn't call Julian. The initial shock gave way to something else. A heavy gray fog rolled in and settled over everything. His books felt like dust and paper. The wine tasted like vinegar. The future he had so carefully curated was no longer a calm library. It was an empty room with the lights off. He stopped leaving the house. The phone rang. He let it go to voicemail. Friends invited him to dinner. He declined. The world outside demanded a version of himself. A wronged man, a man who should be angry that he no longer had the energy to portray. The betrayal had stolen his past, and the depression was stealing his future, one silent, unmoving hour at a time. One afternoon, 3 weeks into his self-imposed exile, he picked up a book from his floor, a first edition of Dante's Inferno. He idly flipped to the 9th circle, the one for traitors. They were frozen in a lake of ice, cold, miserable, alone. He looked at his own life. He was in his own frozen lake. But Julian, he thought, Julian was out there, warm, rich, and unpunished. The thought should have enraged him. Instead, it was like a single clear note in a world of fog. Unpunished. The word echoed. The fog didn't lift, but it thinned just a little. He wasn't interested in punishment that looked like violence or a screaming match. He was a curator, a collector. His revenge would be a collection, too. A collection of consequences. He got up, showered, and called Sarah. "I need you to find me everything," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Every shell company, every doctored invoice, every digital footprint. Build me a complete and unimpeachable case." Over the next 6 months, Elias worked with the cold, precise focus of a bookbinder repairing a priceless manuscript. While Julian was hosting lavish parties and expanding his personal art collection, Elias was meeting with the firm's other minority shareholders, showing them the truth. In quiet coffee shops, he was talking to the company's biggest clients, not to slander Julian, but to simply ask, "Are you aware of the new third-party vendors we're using for your logistics?" He didn't build a weapon. He built a mirror. The day of the reckoning was not a confrontation. It was a board meeting. Elias, dressed in a simple gray suit, walked into the conference room he hadn't entered in 5 years. Julian looked up from the head of the table, his face a practiced mask of surprise and concern. "Elias, what a wonderful surprise. How are you feeling?" "Clear-headed, Julian," Elias said, taking a seat. "For the first time in a long time." He passed a thick leather-bound dossier to each person at the table. On the cover, it simply said, A history of partnership. Julian opened his. As he turned the pages, the color drained from his face. The mask of concern slipped, revealing something raw and panicked beneath. He saw the money trails, the shell companies, the emails Sarah had unearthed. He saw the meticulous documentation of his crime. This is a gross misinterpretation, Julian stammered. Creative accounting. Elias, you of all people should understand the need for financial flexibility. Elias looked at him. He didn't see his old friend. He saw a man frozen in the headlights, and for a moment Elias felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. But the fog of his depression was still there, a cold barrier, and the feeling didn't penetrate. The need isn't in question, Elias said quietly. The theft is. The other shareholders were silent, their faces hard. They weren't Elias's friends. They were investors, and they had just seen the value of their investment systematically looted. Over the next week, the Mirror did its work. The board, armed with the dossier, launched its own investigation. Julian was suspended. The scandal, kept carefully within the business pages, was damning enough. Clients, uncomfortable with the fraud, began to review their contracts. The consulting companies were dissolved, but the money they had siphoned was tied up in assets Julian couldn't quickly liquidate. The final blow was not Elias's doing, but it was just the partners, to save the firm's reputation and salvage the remaining value, voted to buy out Julian's shares. Not at a premium, but at a price that reflected the damage he had caused. It was a fraction of what he believed his empire was worth. He was rich then, in an instant, merely comfortable. His creation, his reputation, his network of power, all meticulously dismantled by the evidence of his own handiwork. Elias watched the news of the settlement from his study, a cup of cold tea in his hand. He felt no soaring triumph, no cathartic release. The gray fog was still there, a constant companion, but it was different now. It wasn't a prison. It was just the weather. He looked at the books on his shelves. They were just books again. The wine was just wine. He was 45% owner of a slightly damaged but stable company, and he had a long, quiet future ahead of him to decide what to do with that. Julian, the master architect of his own downfall, was out there somewhere, forced to live in the world he had tried to build for Elias. A world of diminished returns and solitary consequences. And for Elias Thorne, a man who had lost a friend but found his own quiet strength, that was enough. It wasn't happiness, but it was justice. And for now, that would do. The unraveling. The first year after Julian's ouster was a strange, suspended thing. Elias threw himself into the reconstruction of the firm, not out of passion, but out of a grim sense of obligation. He was the one who had exposed the rot. It fell to him to oversee the repairs. He hired new financial officers. He personally visited every major client, offering not excuses but transparency. He showed them the new safeguards, the third-party audits, the structural changes that made another betrayal impossible. Some clients left anyway. Most stayed. A few, impressed by his candor, increased their commitments. The work was exhausting. It required him to be present, to speak, to make decisions. There were days he woke up and the fog was so thick he could barely move. But he had learned something about depression in those months after the betrayal. It didn't disappear when you were useful, but sometimes it let you work through it. Sarah, the forensic accountant, had become something like a fixture in his life. Not a friend, exactly. Elias wasn't sure he remembered how to make those anymore, but a trusted presence. She would appear in his office with reports, stay for tea, and leave. She asked no questions about his moods, offered no unsolicited advice. She simply existed in his orbit, quietly reliable. It was Sarah who brought him the news. 14 months after the board meeting. Julian's selling the house, she said, sliding a printout across his desk. The one in the Hamptons, listed last week. Elias glanced at the listing. He remembered that house. He had spent a dozen weekends there, had sat on that wraparound porch watching the sunset, had believed himself happy. Julian's wife, ex-wife now apparently, had kept a garden of wild roses that smelled of honey and salt air. Why? Elias asked. Liquidity problems. The settlement didn't bankrupt him, but it left him asset-rich and cash-poor. He's been trying to launch a new venture, a tech consultancy. It's not going well. His reputation precedes him. Elias set the paper down. He should have felt something. Vindication, perhaps? Or the warm glow of karma finally catching up. He felt nothing. That's not all, Sarah said. She hesitated, which was unlike her. He's been calling, leaving messages with my office. He wants to talk to you. What about... He didn't say, but he sounds different. Desperate, maybe. Or just lonely. Elias considered this. He thought of the ninth circle, the traitors frozen in ice. Lonely. Yes, that tracked. I have nothing to say to him. Sarah nodded and gathered her things. At the door, she paused. He knows what he did, Elias. That's the thing about people like Julian. They always know. They just expect you to forget. She left. Elias stared at the wall for a long time. The call came 3 weeks later, not to his office, but to his home, the landline. Elias almost didn't answer it. No one used that number anymore. Elias. Julian's voice was rougher than he remembered, stripped of its old polish. Please don't hang up. Elias said nothing. He could hear traffic in the background. A payphone, then. Julian calling from a payphone. I'm not asking for money, Julian said quickly. I know better than that. I need you to know something. Still, Elias was silent. I never meant for you to find out. A bitter laugh crackled through the line. That's a hell of a thing to say, isn't it? I spent 4 years stealing from you, and what I regret most is getting caught. That's who I am. That's who I became. Elias closed his eyes. The fog stirred, restless. Do you remember, Julian continued, the summer we built the deck at your cabin? You kept dropping nails and I kept stepping on them. You said I was the clumsiest man you'd ever met. I said you were the most patient. We laughed about that for years. Elias remembered. He remembered the smell of cedar shavings and the way the lake had glittered through the trees. He remembered believing they would be old men together, sitting on that deck, watching the world go by. I don't expect forgiveness, Julian said. I don't even deserve a hearing. But I wanted you to know that I remember, too. That somewhere inside this thing I've become, there's still the man who loved you like a brother. He's just buried very deep. The line hummed with static. Elias opened his eyes. He looked around his study. The books, the wine, the quiet order of a life built on trust that had been shattered and was now, slowly, being rebuilt on something harder, something truer. I believe you, Elias said. His voice was calm, measured. I believe there's a version of you that loved me. But that version is a ghost, Julian. You killed him yourself, one doctored invoice at a time. And I don't make conversation with ghosts. He hung up. For a long moment he stood there, his hand still resting on the receiver. Then he walked to his wine cabinet, selected a bottle he'd been saving, a 1995 Bordeaux, purchased the year they'd founded the firm together, and carried it to the kitchen. He opened it. He poured a glass. He took a sip. It was good wine, complex, layered, with a finish that lingered. Everything wine should be. He poured the rest down the sink. The second year brought unexpected gifts. The first was a letter from a young woman named Priya Sharma, a junior partner at the firm Elias had never met. She wrote to thank him. His restructuring had created new opportunities for younger staff, and she had been promoted to lead a major client account. She was the first person in her family to hold such a position. She enclosed a photograph of herself at her desk, smiling with a small framed picture of Elias squinted. Was that him? It was a newspaper clipping from the business section, the one announcing his return as acting CEO. He wrote back, a short note, formal but warm. He wished her well. He told her the firm was lucky to have her. She replied, they began a correspondence, old-fashioned letters posted through the mail. She asked about the early days of the company. He asked about her family, her ambitions, her favorite books. She recommended a contemporary novel. He sent her a first edition of something he thought she might like. She sent him a drawing her niece had made of his photograph, a stick figure with wild hair and a very large nose. Elias hung it on his refrigerator. The second gift came in the form of a stray cat, a small, scruffy orange thing that appeared on his back porch during a rainstorm and refused to leave. Elias, who had never owned a pet, had no idea what to do with it. He bought food. He bought a bed. He bought toys the cat ignored. The cat slept on his chest at night, a warm, purring weight that made the fog feel less absolute. He named it, against all reason, Nails. In honor of a summer deck and a clumsy friend and a life that was gone, the third gift was simpler. One morning he woke up and the fog was thinner. Not gone. He suspected it would never fully leave, but thinner. He could see the edges of things more clearly. He made coffee without having to remind himself how. He walked to the window and watched the sunrise, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like an accusation. He was not happy, he was not healed, but he was present, and that, he was learning, was its own kind of victory. The third year, Julian came to him. Not in person. Elias would not have allowed that. But his shadow fell across Elias's path in unexpected ways. A mutual acquaintance mentioned running into Julian at a job fair. He was looking for work, any work, and had been turned away. A former client called Elias to ask, delicately, whether Julian could be trusted with a small consulting contract. Elias answered with careful honesty, "He's brilliant. He's also a thief. You decide." The client did not hire him. Then, in the spring, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside, a single photograph, the deck at Elias's cabin, freshly rebuilt. New cedar, new nails, new railings, and tucked into the railing a small envelope with Elias's name on it. He drove to the cabin that weekend. He hadn't been there since before the diagnosis, before the betrayal, before everything. The key still worked. The inside was dusty but intact. He walked through the rooms, touching things, remembering. Then he went outside. The deck was beautiful. Better than the original. Julian had always been handy when he wanted to be. He just hadn't wanted to be. Not for years. The work was precise, careful, loving. It must have taken weeks. The envelope contained no letter, just a single nail. Old, bent, rusted. One of the ones Elias had dropped all those years ago, that Julian had stepped on. Elias held it in his palm. He thought about forgiveness. He thought about ghosts. He thought about the man who had loved him, and the man who had stolen from him, and the impossible truth that they were the same person. He walked to the edge of the lake and threw the nail as far as he could. It arced through the air, glinted once in the sunlight, and disappeared into the water. Then he went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat on his new deck watching the lake until the stars came out. Epilogue. 5 years later, the firm had a new CEO now, Priya Sharma, the young woman who had written him that first letter. She was brilliant, fierce, and utterly incorruptible. Elias had mentored her for 2 years before stepping back, and watching her lead was like watching a garden he had planted finally bloom. He remained a shareholder. He attended board meetings. He offered advice when asked. But mostly, he lived his quiet life in his house with his books and his wine, and his orange cat who had grown fat and demanding and absolutely essential. He never spoke to Julian again. He heard things, occasionally, that Julian had moved to a smaller city, that he was working at a bookstore, that he had been seen at a support group for people struggling with compulsive behavior. The reports came with less frequency as the years passed, and then they stopped altogether. Elias did not forgive him. He did not forget, but he also did not carry the betrayal like a weight anymore. It was simply a part of his story, one chapter among many. The chapter where he learned that trust could be broken, and the chapter where he learned that broken things could still be beautiful. One evening, late, he sat on his back porch, not the cabin porch, but the small one off his kitchen, the one where Nails liked to watch birds, and thought about justice. He had not destroyed Julian. He had not ruined him. He had simply shown the world who Julian was, and the world had responded accordingly. Julian had done the rest to himself. That was the thing about mirrors. They didn't create the reflection. They just showed it. Nails jumped into his lap and began to purr. Elias stroked the warm orange fur and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. He thought about calling Priya just to say hello. He thought about opening a bottle of wine. He thought about nothing at all and let the quiet settle around him like a blanket. He was not happy. He was not healed. But he was here, in this moment, fully present. And for a man who had spent years frozen in his own personal ice, that was the greatest justice of all.